The air in the hearing room was cold, heavy, and silent. Across the polished mahogany table sat my father, Colonel Eva Rostova, a man who believed his parade ground voice could command any room into submission. But here, his authority was a dead language, and he looked utterly lost. The man questioning him was Captain Davis, a JAG officer with a gaze that could cut glass, who slid a single document across the table. "Colonel, your signature is on the transfer request," Davis stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "But the supplemental data you included, that is what triggered the flag." My father let out a harsh, arrogant scoff. "It's an old logistics marker, for God's sake. A private note between old soldiers." Captain Davis didn't even dignify him with a glance. Instead, his head turned slightly toward the shadows where I stood observing. "Captain Rostova?" he asked, his voice echoing in the soundproofed room. "Is this the communication you flagged under Protocol 7 Delta?" I took a steadying breath and stepped forward into the sterile fluorescent light, my uniform immaculate. "Yes, sir. It is." The confusion on my father's face was a sight to behold. It morphed from indignant pride to pure, unadulterated shock. He stared at me, at my rank, at my place in this room of consequence, as if he was seeing a ghost. Just 1 week before, that ghost had been standing in the cluttered comfort of my parents' living room, home on a short leave. My father stood before me, beaming with a pride I hadn't seen directed at me in years, waving a copy of a letter like it was a medal. "I've done it, Eva," he announced, his voice booming. "I pulled some strings with my old contacts at Human Resources Command. I'm finally getting you out of that glorified secretarial pool." A familiar coldness seeped into my stomach as I took the paper. I read the words he'd written, a formal request for my transfer, citing family hardship, and, most insultingly, my unsuitability for high-stress administrative roles. I saw a lifetime of dismissals in that single phrase. I tried to protest, to tell him he had no idea what he was meddling in, but he just waved a dismissive hand. "Don't worry," he said, tapping a paragraph near the bottom. I put in some old logistical routing codes, just a bit of inside baseball. "My friend at HRC will know exactly what it means. It's handled." Then, he patted me on the head, a gesture so condescending it stole the air from my lungs. He thought he was saving my career. He had no idea he had just lit the fuse on a bomb. He chuckled, thinking he'd done me a favor. He had no idea the logistical codes he'd used were a near-perfect match. For a hostile intelligence signature my unit was actively hunting. He thought he was speaking to an old friend. Instead, he was whispering to an enemy. To understand the reckoning that followed, you have to understand the two lives I was living. To my father, Colonel Eva Rostova, a man obsessed with the fading glory of his own legacy, the world was divided into two kinds of people, soldiers and support staff. He had decided long ago which category I fell into. In his mind, my quiet, intellectual nature wasn't a strength, it was a disqualifier. He gave me nicknames, meant to be affectionate but landing like tiny, persistent cuts. I was the scribe when he wanted to sound magnanimous, or my little paper pusher when he was feeling particularly dismissive. His view of my career was a fiction he'd constructed to fit his narrow world view, and he was the sole author and publisher of that story. The narrative was never clearer than at family dinners. I remember one in particular, a few months before the incident with the letter. He stood at the head of the table, glass of scotch raised, launching into a toast that was, as always, really about himself. He spoke of his time in logistics, of moving real assets for real soldiers. He painted pictures with his words of tanks rolling across frozen fields and convoys of supplies reaching the front line. It was all very dramatic, the stuff of movies. Then, as his grand speech wound down, he turned his gaze to me, a dismissive afterthought. "And Eva," he said, a patronizing smile on his face. "Well, she keeps the paperwork tidy. Every army needs that, I suppose." The table offered polite chuckles. I just stared into my plate, the familiar heat rising in my cheeks. It wasn't just the public condescension. It was the echo of a dozen other moments. The academic decathlon trophy he'd forgotten, the coding competition he'd called a hobby, the way his eyes would glaze over if I ever tried to explain the complexities of network theory. Later that evening, my mother, Elena, a woman who treated my father's ego like an unexploded bomb to be constantly, carefully managed, found me in the kitchen. She placed a hand on my arm, her touch light and apologetic. "You know how your father is," she whispered, as if that explained everything. "He just doesn't understand all this computer stuff. He's from a different time. Just let him have his stories." And I knew what she meant. She meant that her peace, the family's peace, required my silence. It required me to shrink, to accept the role of the footnote in his grand narrative. It had been the price of admission my entire life. My other world, my real world, was a place my father couldn't even imagine. It was a sensitive, compartmented information facility, a SCIF, a windowless box of reinforced concrete buried in the heart of the base where the only sounds were the whisper of industrial air conditioning and the quiet, frantic clicking of keyboards. The air tasted of recycled oxygen and ozone from the servers that lined the walls, their blinking lights a silent digital constellation. This was where I wasn't the scribe. Here, I was in command. My screen wasn't filled with paperwork, it was a waterfall of raw, encrypted data streaming in from satellites and listening posts around the globe. This was where the real assets were, not tons of steel, but petabytes of information that could mean the difference between life and death. On one particularly grueling shift, I stood behind my team of analysts, my eyes scanning the torrent of data on the main screen. "I need a pattern of life analysis on that last burst transmission from the Eastern Corridor," I said, my voice low but clear. "Cross-reference the SIGAD with the ghost signal parameters." Now, there was no hesitation, just the immediate flurry of fingers on keyboards. My commanding officer, Major Thompson, a sharp, no-nonsense intel officer who said so little that every word he spoke carried the weight of a dozen, stood near the back of the room. He didn't command with volume, he commanded with presence. He was watching, always watching. For hours, we chased shadows, until I saw it. A flicker. An anomaly so small it was almost statistically invisible. A single packet of data that didn't fit the established pattern. It was a ghost, a whisper. "Isolate that signal," I ordered, my heart beginning to pound with the thrill of the hunt. "Magnify and decrypt." Now, the room was dead silent, save for the hum of the machines. The data unscrambled on the screen, revealing a nested communication, a message hidden within a message. It was the ghost signal. We had it. Major Thompson moved to my shoulder, his eyes fixed on the screen. He looked at the data, then at me, and gave a rare, almost imperceptible nod. "Good catch, Rostova," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You just prevented a major network breach." The quiet, collective exhale from my team was more rewarding than any public praise. In this room, respect wasn't given. It was earned in silence, through sheer competence. Later that night, after the family dinner, I sat in my car in my parents' driveway. The sound of their laughter and my father's booming voice faded as I closed the door, leaving me in a pocket of profound silence. My two worlds had never felt so far apart. My encrypted device buzzed on the passenger seat. I picked it up. A new message from Major Thompson glowed on the screen. It was simple, direct, and meant only for me. Intel confirmed. "Your analysis was correct. Asset rerouted. Good work, Echo 7. My call sign. My real name, in a way. I looked at the warm yellow light of my childhood home, then back at the cold blue light of the screen. In that house, I was Eva, the scribe. But out here, in the dark, I was Echo 7, a critical intelligence asset. For the first time, the chasm between those two identities didn't just feel frustrating or unfair. It felt dangerous. For years, I had accepted the two versions of me. The daughter my father saw, and the officer I really was. But his letter wasn't just an insult anymore. He had taken his ignorance and fired it like a weapon into the heart of my world. They only respected procedure and authority, so I decided I would finally speak to them in the only language they understood. The next morning back on base, the familiar rhythm of order and discipline settled over me like a suit of armor. The emotional chaos of my family home faded with every step I took across the manicured grounds. There was no room for hurt feelings here. There was only protocol and procedure. In the quiet of my office, I laid my father's letter on my desk and read it again. This time, I wasn't reading it as his daughter. I was reading it as an analyst. The condescending phrases about my unsuitability became irrelevant noise. All that mattered was the data. My mind filtered out everything but the string of characters he had so proudly called inside baseball. To a layman, it was a meaningless jumble of letters and numbers. But to my trained eyes, it was a glaring anomaly. The specific syntax, the grouping of the characters, the length of the string, it was a statistical improbability that mirrored the communication markers of a hostile intelligence service we were tracking. In my world, a world built on finding patterns in chaos, there are no coincidences. A cold, hard clarity settled over me. This was no longer a family squabble. This was a potential security breach. My objective wasn't revenge, it was containment. With the letter in hand, I walked to Major Thompson's office. My posture was perfect, my steps measured. My hand didn't tremble as I knocked on his door. When he told me to enter, I closed the door quietly behind me and stood before his desk. I didn't say, "My dad did something incredibly stupid," or "You won't believe this." I placed the letter squarely in the center of his desk and said, my voice as steady and flat. "As a dial tone, sir, I have a potential counter-to-intelligence incident to report." In that moment, I wasn't his daughter anymore. I was an officer of the United States Army, reporting a threat as my duty required. Major Thompson's expression shifted as he read, moving from professional curiosity to disbelief, and finally landing on a grim seriousness that made the air in the room feel heavy. He looked up from the page, his eyes locking onto mine. He didn't offer a word of sympathy or ask about my family. He simply gave a command. "Report this, now." He tapped the offending paragraph with his finger. "Whether your father is a bumbling fool or a traitor, this document has officially triggered a counterintelligence flag. It is out of our hands." He picked up his desk phone and dialed the extension for the base inspector general. The system was now engaged. The trap wasn't being set by my anger, but by my unwavering adherence to the very protocols designed to protect my world. The official summons was sent to my father's address via courier. He called me, laughing, saying the army must have made a mistake, and he'd go down there to clear it all up. He had no idea he wasn't visiting his world of old favors and handshakes. He was entering my world by my report to face my authority. The hearing room was designed to erase personality. The walls were covered in gray acoustic tiling that swallowed sound, making the silence feel heavy and absolute. There were no flags, no decorations, just a polished table and a set of severe government-issued chairs. It was a place for facts, not feelings, a sterile environment for formal inquiries and counterintelligence briefings. It was my world, and my father, Colonel Eva Rostova, had just walked right into the center of it, completely unprepared. He arrived wearing his old service uniform, the fabric stretched tight across his proud chest, a silent declaration of a rank he thought still held power here. He expected to intimidate some junior officer, to clear up a simple misunderstanding with a stern word and a reminder of who he was. When he saw me sitting at the far end of the table next to Major Thompson and two JAG officers, a flicker of confusion crossed his face, quickly replaced by his default setting, condescension. He assumed I was there to take notes, a secretary or a junior aide brought in to observe. He gave me a slow, patronizing wink, a silent little message that said, "Don't worry, I'll handle this." A lifetime of being underestimated was contained in that single gesture. I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. It was the calm of an equation about to be solved, of a final variable being put into place. I met his wink with a blank, unreadable expression. The lead JAG officer, Captain Davis, began without preamble. His voice was as flat and sterile as the room itself. "Colonel Rostova, this is a formal inquiry into a potential security breach initiated by this document." An image of my father's letter, his proud, foolish letter, flashed onto the large screen on the wall. "You claim this alphanumeric sequence," Davis said, pointing to the highlighted code, "is an old logistics marker." My father puffed out his chest, leaning into the microphone on the table. "That's right," he said, his voice confident. "It's a way for old soldiers to talk. A little inside baseball." He was trying to establish his territory, to frame this as a misunderstanding between men of a certain world. But Captain Davis refused to enter that world. "Our signals intelligence division disagrees," he continued, his voice never wavering. "They identify this structure as a near-perfect match for a communication signature, used by the SBR's 85th Main Center for Clandestine Communications." He paused, letting the official, alien-sounding name hang in the air. "They call it the ghost signal." I watched my father's face. The confident smirk didn't vanish, not yet, but it tightened at the edges. The language of the room had suddenly shifted from something he understood to something complex and threatening. He was no longer on solid ground. He reacted the only way he knew how, with a loud, barking laugh meant to show how ridiculous he found all this. "That's insane," he boomed, looking around the table for allies he didn't have. "This is a family matter. A misunderstanding. My daughter is an administrator. What in the hell would she know about ghost signals?" The room went dead silent. Major Thompson, who had been a silent, imposing statue until this moment, leaned slowly toward his microphone. The small click as it activated was like the cocking of a hammer. "Colonel," he said, his voice quiet but cutting through the tension like a razor. "Your daughter is Captain Eva Rostova. Her call sign is Echo 7. My father's eyes widened slightly. Thompson continued, his words slow and deliberate, each one a nail in the coffin of my father's worldview. "She is the lead analyst for Operation Silent Echo, the very task force that identified the ghost signal 6 months ago. Her name, not yours, is on every single classified brief about this threat that has gone to the Pentagon." He let that sink in. I watched the blood drain from my father's face. "The letter you sent," Thompson concluded, his voice dropping to an icy whisper, triggered a Level 1 counterintelligence alert that forced my division to burn 48 hours of operational time to determine if you were a compromised agent of a foreign power or simply a fool. The unspoken word, traitor, hung in the air between us. The smug confidence on my father's face completely evaporated, replaced by the pale, clammy sheen of sheer panic. His entire reality had been dismantled in less than a minute. His head swiveled toward me, his eyes wide with a desperate, pleading confusion. He was looking for his daughter, the little paper pusher, but she wasn't there. I met his gaze with the cold, detached focus of an analyst observing a critical data point. He was finally seeing me for the first time, not as his child, but as a ranking officer in a world he could not possibly comprehend. Captain Davis delivered the final blow, his voice a dispassionate hammer of judgment. The inquiry's primary witness, who first flagged the threat according to protocol, was Captain Rostova herself. I saw it then. A lifetime of military bearing overriding conscious thought. My father's back straightened, his hands snapped to his sides, an involuntary, pathetic posture of subordination born of pure shock. My father had spent my entire life teaching me about the importance of rank and protocol. In the end, it only took one intelligence report for him to finally learn who he was talking to. The inquiry concluded without fanfare. There was no dramatic verdict, only the quiet, bureaucratic finality of a decision being read into the record. The official finding determined that my father's actions were born, not of malice, but of staggering ignorance and profound arrogance. It was a judgment that, in many ways, felt more damning than treason. It wasn't a single criminal act, but a condemnation of his entire character. The consequences were swift and absolute. His security clearances, the last vestiges of the authority he clung to, were permanently revoked. A formal letter of censure would be placed in his permanent file, an indelible stain on the pristine legacy he had spent his life curating. He had obsessed over his own story for so long that he never realized he was no longer its hero. As we filed out of the sterile room, the silence was broken by my father's voice, stammering my name. Eva, wait." He took a step toward me, his face a mess of confusion and shame. A broken man trying to understand the rubble of the world he had just destroyed. But before he could reach me, Major Thompson moved between us, a silent, unbreachable wall. He didn't say a word to my father, he just gave a curt, dismissive nod and placed a steadying hand on my shoulder, guiding me away. The other officers from my division fell into step beside me, a protective formation. My true peers were closing ranks around me, and for the first time I felt the profound, unshakable strength of belonging. 6 months later, that feeling had become the new foundation of my life. The world had shifted on its axis, and I had found my true north. The nameplate on my new office door was simple and elegant, polished brass letters that spelled, out a reality my father never could have imagined, Section Chief, Captain Eva Rostova. My promotion had been fast-tracked. The official citation noted that my handling of the incident was a masterclass in duty over personal compromise. I was no longer just a lead analyst, I was a leader, entrusted with my own section, my own team, and my own corner of the mission. I now stood at the head of a briefing table in a state-of-the-art command center. directing the flow of information that was the lifeblood of national security. The respect I received in that room wasn't given because of my name or my family. It was earned with every correct analysis and every sound decision. After one particularly successful briefing, my team surprised me. They had brought in a cake and cheap champagne to celebrate the official conclusion of Operation Silent Echo, the very operation that had started everything. We stood around the briefing table, sharing stories and inside jokes that only we would understand. The laughter was genuine, the camaraderie effortless. I looked at the faces of my colleagues, these brilliant, dedicated people who saw me for exactly who I was, and a profound realization settled over me. This was my family now. Not one built on the shaky foundations of obligation and blood, but one forged in the quiet, high-stakes world of shared purpose and mutual respect. This was a home I had built for myself. Later that evening, while reviewing preliminary data for our next mission, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from my mother. The subject line was just 2 words, heavy with a history I no longer felt obligated to carry. Your father. I hesitated for only a moment before opening it. She wrote that he was a changed man, that the arrogance had been sandblasted out of him, leaving behind someone quiet and withdrawn. She wrote that he missed me, and she asked if I could find it in my heart to call him. I read the words, and I felt nothing. Not anger, not sadness, not even a flicker of triumph. Just a calm, quiet distance. It was the detached feeling of reading a report about a distant event that no longer had any bearing on my current operation. My peace was no longer a variable in their family equation. I held my finger over the screen for a second, then deliberately tapped the archive button. The message vanished, filed away but not deleted. It was a part of my history, but not a part of my future. I set the phone down and turned my full attention back to the large monitor displaying global network. Traffic, my focus already shifting to the next puzzle, the next threat, the next mission. My father spent his life talking about the codes that moved armies. He never imagined the one code that truly mattered was the one that demanded my silence, my duty, and my name.